Story 1. I am starting to have my doubts about this Blair Witch. Okay, on a serious note, Nanook of the North really kind of kicked off the documentary movement as we know it today and was full of many staged scenarios and false facts. Still an important and interesting film, but it shows how long this issue has persisted in documentary form. At the very least, Robert J. Flaherty was pretty open about his embellishments compared to some of the folks listed in the comments. Story 2. Super Size Me is the obligatory example. Morgan Spurlock conveniently left out the part about him being an alcoholic and a vegan when he started his experiment. Story 3. The Teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui Way of Knowledge. A University of California, Los Angeles, anthropology student travels to Mexico to study psychedelics. He meets a native medicine man and becomes his apprentice. This was during the 1960s and 1970s Chicano movement, and connection to native ancestry was really popular, as was experimenting with psychedelics. The book was a popular success, and the author released a few sequels. All of it was nonsense. It was made up. Story 4. Alien Autopsy. While they never proved it to be real, they heavily implied it. One thing they did was show the video to special effects artists who said they couldn't recreate that amount of detail of the alien's inner organs. Turns out the person who faked it just used pig organs. Story 5. Several months ago, we watched a random Tubi thing called Bigfoot vs. Yeti for a laugh. A foolish thing about who would win. The problem is that I think one or two people at the beginning acknowledged they were fictional creatures, but every other interviewed person presented their opinion as if it was fact. Things like, we know that the Bigfoot is sensitive to sound. We do? How? When? I didn't start watching it with high expectations, but I was still disappointed at how it was presented since it was made up nonsense opinions for 90 minutes. I guess this is no different from a lot of paranormal and alien content. Half these documentaries need to have big disclaimers running through the whole feature because what they're saying is stuff from their imagination. Maybe I'm not desensitized enough and dislike things being presented as news or fact when they're not. Story 6. The whole Ancient Aliens thing on the History Channel was lies piled on top of misinformation piled on top of academic mistakes that had long been corrected before the show. But the people who liked the narrative chose to keep using it as fact. None of it was true. Every single point they ever made in favor of ancient aliens existing has been thoroughly debunked. Story 7. Any and all finding shows like Finding Bigfoot. Never once found anything. Story leads to a cliffhanger, then a commercial, and the cliffhanger turns out to be easily explained. This repeats for 8 seasons. Story 8. Live to 100. Secrets of the Blue Zones. Some of the blue zones they visited are already no longer blue zones. There is no science being done, just speculation from data. Story 9. Their science dad, also known as the Führer, gives a city to the Jews. Nazi propaganda shot in 1944 in a concentration camp that had been modified during the production to give the impression that the Jews were living healthily and happily there. Possibly one of the worst instances of cynicism by Nazis, which is saying something. Story 10. Super Size Me tries to make out McDonald's is entirely to blame for his health issues. A doctor even says something along the lines of, "You've got the liver of an alcoholic." And he claims to not drink, so it must be the food doing it, only for it to come out years later that he was, in fact, an alcoholic. There's quite a lot else wrong with that documentary that makes it very biased, but that was always the bit that stuck with me. Story 11. Finding Kendrick Johnson is full of misinformation. It uses a report that clears the suspect it puts forth as its only evidence and then just ignores that the report proves his alibi. Story 12. Nanook of the North, the first ever feature-length documentary. There was no precedent concerning ethics and truth, so the director staged most of what you see in the movie. Story 13. There's a Canadian documentary about 2 guys who are released from jail. The supervisor of the trailer park they live in is out to get them for some reason. I think maybe parts of it might be staged. Story 14. Anything directed or featuring former physician Andrew Wakefield. Vaxxed. From Covered Up to Catastrophe, April 2016. Vaxxed 2. The People's Truth, 2019 or 2020. Infertility. A Diabolical Truth, June 2022. Vaxxed 3. Authorized to Kill, September 2024. Story 15. The A&E documentary about Lacey Peterson. Scott literally murdered her, and he's too much of a psychopath to admit it. At least Chris Watts eventually confessed with the true story. Story 16. Reefer Madness. It was shown to me in high school. What a joke. Nobody I knew believed that nonsense. That was the very beginning of me not trusting my government. Story 17. United Passions. 2014 English language French drama film. It is about the origins of the world governing body of Association Football, Fédération Internationale de Football Association, FIFA. 90% funded by FIFA. It stars Tim Roth, Gerard Depardieu, and Sam Neill, and is directed by Frederick Auberton. The film's United States release coincided with the 2015 FIFA corruption case, in which several current and former members of FIFA's executive committee were arrested for charges of corruption. The corruption investigation led to the resignation of FIFA's president, Sepp Blatter, following decades of speculation and accusations of corruption at FIFA under his leadership. The film was accused of ignoring these long-running claims. Roth has said that he asked the filmmakers, "Where's all the corruption in the script? Where's all the backstabbing, the deals?" He said he attempted to convey these elements through his performance, saying, "It was a tough one. I tried to slide in a sense of it as much as I could get in there." The film's director, Frederick Auberton, claimed he inserted ironic parts into the film. Story 18. The documentary about Megalodon being real. The documentary about mermaids being real. There was a similar one about dragons, but that one doesn't count in my opinion because they clearly say in the beginning that it's not real. Super Size Me. The problem wasn't so much McDonald's as it was the protagonist's drug abuse. Anything related to ancient aliens. Story 19. What the bleep do we know? As far as entertainment purposes, it's actually solid. The visual effects were pretty good for its time, kind of trippy. 10 out of 10 worth popping and edible and watching. But the science was rather askew. They tried to make quantum mechanics into the new agey self-help kind of thing. Energies work on the quantum level, so if you think bad thoughts, your houseplants will die, or if you yell at water, it won't be as good for you when you drink it type deal. I don't know. I'm pretty sure at the root it's legitimate, they just stretched it quite a bit. Story 20. Most people have probably forgotten about this movie, but what the bleep do we know? You can basically thank this documentary for mainstreaming a bunch of New Age cult nonsense that inevitably led to the rise of pseudoscientific jargon that people like Joe Rogan promote. Story 21. I don't know if it's considered a documentary, but Carol Baskins was unjustly portrayed in Tiger King. She's no saint, but she absolutely should not have been the most hated person in that show. Story 22. That Final Days of John F. Kennedy Jr. special ABC aired a few years back. I won't speak to what was going on in his personal life, but when they got to his mishap, God, that was awful. According to the Federal Aviation Administration and the National Transportation Safety Board's own investigations, John F. Kennedy Jr. was an incompetent pilot. It's questionable whether he should have had his ratings at all, but especially been able to fly that day. He is the textbook example of poor decision-making as a pilot in the Federal Aviation Administration's own textbooks. ABC pulled out all the stops to make him look like the victim, instead of the arrogant person who killed two innocent people. Story 23. Zeitgeist was so well composed you would think they surely must know what they are talking about. But even as you watch it before any refutation, you should notice such errors as the Son of God equals Son of God equivocation. Story 24. Not quite what you're asking, but those ghost hunting shows are 100% staged. No way Discovery is paying for this haunted house expedition without any insurance. Story 25. What the health? I watched it with my vegan university group, and it was easy to spot the disinformation. The film claimed that eating an egg a day is as bad for your life expectancy as smoking 5 cigarettes a day. Just absolute nonsense. Story 26. Blackfish. If even half of what they said was true, then the American Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the National Wildlife Rehabilitation Network, and Jack Hanna all would have pulled their support from the parks. Plus, The people who made Blackfish had waited until the park went public on the stock market to tank their new stock and used the proceeds from their documentary to open their own aquatic theme park with orcas on display in open sea pens. One of their biggest financial backers basically said there was no evidence their approach was better, and if they had known this was their intent, they never would have invested because they thought at least SeaWorld knew how to properly care for their animals. Story 27, Waiting for Superman, was hailed as an important look into the ways that schools are funded in America and how the funding process is tied to their success. In the end, it used cherry-picked information and emotional appeals to justify voucher programs and charter schools, which then massively helped misinform the public about their school systems and gave rise to people like Betsy DeVos. These talking points were around in conservative think tanks for generations, but this documentary popularized the ideas among liberals, making them mainstream just long enough to take root and help decimate the public school system in vast swaths of the country. It was Davis Guggenheim's follow-up to An Inconvenient Truth. The vast majority of studies have shown all this film's points to be unfounded. But the public relations it did, at the exact time it did it, was a great benefit to DeVos and her like-minded individuals. Story 28, Bowling for Columbine. I am a fan of Michael Moore, however, one of the major elements of his film implied that the two miscreants went bowling prior to the slaughter. They did not. Story 29, The Radical Story of Patty Hearst. CNN interviewed her kidnappers, and they completely controlled the narrative and lied about her time in captivity. One of them says she was in a relationship with one of the captors and had sex with different members. In reality, they raped her in turns because everyone was close and would share each other. Story 30, Supersize Me. All the health detriments Morgan Spurlock was experiencing were supposedly due to eating a diet of nothing but McDonald's for 30 days. Turns out he was a raging alcoholic undergoing liver failure. Story 31. Although Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth was absolutely necessary for me, as an environmental analytical chemist for 20 years, it opened the door for naysayers and those against climate change. The picture of a rusted ship in a desert, which I recognized from an old general chemistry textbook with Al Gore's voiceover saying, "When I flew over this area, it was apparent that climate change was indeed real," ruined it for me. Story 32. I remember watching something about polar bears starving and being miserable because of us humans. Maybe it was on Netflix. Anyway, I was deeply impacted by it. Then, while obsessing about the poor bears on the internet, I found my way to a video that completely obliterated the depressing documentary and exposed it for blatant propaganda and, in short, a big lie. It was a mind-blowing realization, and I was a bit shocked about how the one and only scientist or specialist who knew what she was talking about was silenced and mistreated, and removed from the project for not going along with the false story. It was some years back, all this, but I was a bit shocked to have such a shameless work of absolute deception and mass manipulation exposed so thoroughly. Story 33. Planned Parenthood selling baby parts was proved false, but certain politicians still use it anyway. Senator Blackburn from Tennessee is the worst one. Story 34. Multiple people have attempted to replicate this, but they never succeeded. The liver issues, in particular, seem to have had more to do with the copious amounts of alcohol Spurlock was consuming. Story 35. Two old school examples. Bowling for Columbine, while making some good points in my opinion, very much twisted and falsified facts. That was the first documentary I recognized as untrustworthy. Loose Change, a 9/11 documentary, relied on poorly edited and faked audio, video, and transcripts. And people still believe it. Story 36. Seas Piracy comes to mind. They painted fishermen as the bad guys when the fishermen are the ones most critically invested in sustainable fishing and ensuring the longevity of fisheries. Story 37. The Secrets of the Dead episode abandoning the Titanic proposes that a cargo liner called the Mount Temple was in sight of Titanic the night she sank, saw her distress rockets, and ignored them. This essay explains why everything in the program is false. Story 38. A production being made and labeled as a documentary doesn't guarantee credibility. It's frighteningly easy to present a false narrative by omitting information and sharing only what makes the preferred premise seem plausible. Couple that with an emotive story, and people can be manipulated fairly easily. Making a Murderer has been mentioned a few times, which is a good example of that. Especially in criminal cases, it's essential for a film to honestly present the evidence and counterpoints from both sides. What we sometimes end up with instead are multiple one-sided films on the same issue fighting each other. What's disappointing is that even though it's common knowledge at this point that there are many so-called documentaries with a lack of integrity, there are still too many people who will buy into them and not look any further. This is how you know the propaganda effort worked. Nothing should ever be above question or verification. Story 39 doesn't exactly fit this mold, but the Cecil Hotel documentary basically ends up proving itself to be full of nonsense at the end when you realize how useless these internet sleuths actually are in real life. The documentary would have been 5 minutes long if they had presented the evidence the actual police had from the very beginning of the story. Story 40. I remember when Plandemic was exposed almost immediately after it was released and, within hours, pulled from YouTube. I've seen it and it's 100% false.